Hey, welcome to Furthering Christendom. Today I have a special guest with me, Roberto Di Celglie. I probably could pronounce that a little bit better, but big fan of his work on Aquinas and epistemology and stuff. So really happy to have you on. How you doing?
Oh, very well, very well. I'm now in Rome, the eternal city, so I'm very happy with that.
Yeah, it's a great place to be. It's a great place to be.
Yeah,
Hopefully our paths will cross sometime in the near future. Almost last summer when I was in Rome, but
yeah,
perhaps in
yeah,
the near
yeah.
future. So you have a couple books I want to talk about briefly today.
Mhm.
You have one, God, the Good, and the Spiritual Turn. What's your main thesis in that book?
The main thesis is that commitments to God and the good can put both believers and unbelievers in the best possible condition to attain the truth. This is a view that emerges from comparison between two epistemological perspectives. One of them is what I call mere epistemology. The other one is spiritual turn. Mere epistemology is a widespread view in modern age as a sort of default position. According to mere epistemology, in our intellectual debates, activities, research, we should ultimately rely only on merely epistemic factors, such as evidence, justification, whereas other factors of knowledge that are not strictly epistemic, such as commitments to God, commitment to the good, cannot be taken into consideration, which means that we cannot rely on them unless they have been previously grounded on evidence. In other words, the view is that we should always prefer belief supported by more evidence to belief supported by less evidence, which, needless to say, is a default position in modern age, is accepted by practically everybody, both in the academia and outside, which means that even those who don't engage in scholarly activity embrace this view. And nonetheless, what I argue in this book is that mere epistemology is affected by many problems. And the problem that is of main interest to me is the fact that mere epistemology is unable to explain what frequently occurs when debates are focused on matters that, so to say, touch life, matters in which debaters are personally involved. What occurs in these cases, almost always? Debaters, researchers are not ready to change their mind, even if the available evidence tells them that they should abandon their beliefs. Consider, for example, the existence of God, which is one of those matters that certainly touch life. Uh, Debaters, both believers, unbelievers, theists, and atheists, usually don't change their mind because of these debates. This is something that mere epistemology simply does not explain, simply rejects as a sort of mistake. It's implausible to believe that so many thinkers, sometimes outstanding thinkers, commit such a trivial mistake. In any case, what I do in my book is to make reference to the Christian tradition, take into consideration suggestions that emerge from this tradition, from great thinkers, and show that Christian believers are required to uh, stick to their beliefs, to be tenacious, to not be ready to change their mind, at least in some cases, not always, but in some cases, when beliefs that are considered undeniable to them, the existence of God, for example, God exists, when beliefs such as that are at stake. In these cases, believers are required to stick to their beliefs, even against the available evidence. And this is something that mere epistemology does not explain, as I said, especially if we consider that this inconclusiveness, by inconclusiveness, I means the fact that debaters are not ready to change their mind even against the available evidence. So this inconclusiveness for believers may even be part of a possibility to promote rationality in the best possible way. How is it possible that? Because believers are required to stick to their beliefs because they should commit themselves to God. They should devote themselves to God. Of course, I'm talking about paradigmatic believers. They are expected to love God, to trust in Him, and then to adhere to everything they find in divine revelation. That's why they are required to stick to their beliefs, to be tenacious. So, commitments to God is also commitment to the good, because according to classical theism, God coincides with good. And so, if one commits oneself to God, one also commits oneself to the good. And commitment to the good means adoption of good habits, which in the case of intellectual activities means adoption of virtues such as intellectual humility, docility, open-mindedness, all virtues that can only put debaters in the best possible condition to promote rationality, to promote and conduct intellectual investigations. This is what, as I said, mere epistemology cannot even understand. That's why I say, and this is the main thesis of my book, I say that a spiritual turn from mere epistemology should be taken.
Great, that's really helpful. So you mentioned that was kind of like the main motivation or whatnot. Any sort of other reasons that we might kind of prefer going this spiritual turn route rather than the kind of mere epistemology?
Yeah, one motivation is that one that I already mentioned, the fact that the spiritual turn is able to explain what mere epistemology doesn't even understand. I may also say that one more motivation is the fact that the spiritual turn is a more comprehensive view than mere epistemology. It's not just a way to reject mere epistemology outright. Mere epistemology can be accepted on many occasions, probably even under a majority of circumstances. But there are circumstances in which the spiritual turn needs to intervene. So the spiritual turn is a more comprehensive view, and this can be understood if we take into consideration the fact that mere epistemology falls into self-referential contradiction, whereas the spiritual turn doesn't. Consider what I said before. Mere epistemology can be seen as the view that we should always prefer belief supported by more evidence to belief supported by less evidence. Obviously enough, this is a view that applies always and so should apply also to itself, but it doesn't, because there is no more evidence in support of mere epistemology if compared to its opposite, the opposite view, which is we should not always prefer belief supported by more evidence to belief supported by less evidence. In other words, this latter view, which is the spiritual turn, means that not always, but in some cases, it may be epistemologically right to prefer belief supported by less evidence to belief supported by more evidence. So the spiritual turn is a more comprehensive view if compared to mere epistemology. And one more thing that could be said in support of this idea may emerge if we focus on on my choice, on the choice of the words, spiritual and turn. Why did I choose these words? Turn reminds us of the linguistic turn, according to which philosophical problems can be fruitfully be treated if they are taken as problems of language. In the same vein, the spiritual turn in epistemology shows that epistemological problems can be profitably approached if they are seen as problems of spirit, where spirit is a word that I use because Hegel introduced this word in the philosophical realm to mean all that exists and not just part of it. In the same vein, The spiritual turn in epistemology shows that epistemological problems can be successfully be treated if they are seen from a viewpoint that is not just epistemic, but a viewpoint that also includes moral and religious dimensions. In other words, not only the human person from the merely intellectual viewpoint, but the human person taken in its entirety. So these are reasons that show that spiritual turn is a wider perspective if compared to mere epistemology, and then we should adopt it.
Very good. What about, like, let's go ahead and put off my Catholic hat, right? I'll put on my atheist hat. Can I participate, or kind of how should I understand the spiritual turn?
Yeah, unbelievers too, as I said before, can take part in the spiritual turn because the spiritual turn talks about commitment to God and the good. And so commitment to the good may regard unbelievers. This is something that I argue may be seen in contemporary Western society and culture, where we see that there are many people, actually the vast majority of people, sometimes enthusiastically adhere to beliefs and principles such as that all human beings have equal fundamental dignity, that discriminations should be rejected, especially racism, which is horrible and disgusting. All beliefs and principles that are part of the so-called human rights solemnly declared in the last century. These beliefs clearly show a sort of commitment to the good, because from these beliefs, from these principles, we see that no bad habits, no non-commendable attitudes can follow, at least consistently. So I believe that those who don't believe in God, atheists, may take part in the spiritual turn. Of course, there are differences between believers and unbelievers, and I may spend one word about this if you allow me to go on, to go
Go ahead.
ahead.
Uh-huh.
A difference emerges if we consider that these principles are really effective only if they are put into practice, if they become a guide to live consistently with these principles, with these ideas. But put principles into practice is not easy. In this sense, believers have a great advantage over unbelievers because they can rely on a great tradition and a long-standing tradition that allows them to understand how exactly to live accordingly, to live in accordance with those principles, how exactly to translate those principles into reality. They can rely on the Bible, on theological suggestions, on the teachings of the
Magisterium.
churches. Yeah, and so many things that can allow them to put principles into practice, whereas the same thing cannot be said of unbelievers. In the same vein, let me say that an advantage from this may follow for unbelievers over believers, because when both of them fail to put these principles into practice and they don't act in accordance with those grand claims, we may say that believers at that point are less excusable than unbelievers. That's why I say that from this viewpoint, unbelievers can have an advantage over believers.
Sorry. Yeah, that's great. Speaking of kind of longstanding traditions, can you maybe tell us, bring up some big names that maybe you think that kind of advocate for the sort of epistemological approach that you're taking here?
Yeah. Yes, certainly. I devoted the chapters to thinkers such as Plantinga, Newman, Thomas Reid, Thomas Aquinas. Let me say a couple of things about Thomas Reid and Alvin Plantinga. Uh, Thomas Reid says that faith cannot be contradicted by reason. This is something that he shares with Thomas Aquinas. Faith cannot be contradicted by reason. Obviously, this is a view that can only emerge from faith. It cannot be supported by way of reason. And this is very interesting because this view may allow believers to follow reason wherever it leads, to be fully open-minded, because believers, uh, in this case, based on this view that faith cannot be contradicted by reason, will be convinced that in the end, reason will not disprove what they maximally care about, which is faith if they are paradigmatic believers. So believers are put in this possibility, have this possibility, whereas the same cannot be said of unbelievers, because unbelievers typically don't believe because they rely only on reason. And they are aware, and everybody is aware, that reason is fallible. So they may always fear that in the end, reason may disprove what they maximally care about. That's why, not necessarily, but in some cases, they may be prevented from following reason wherever it leads. This is an example that shows how theology and epistemology work together, so to say, in this book. It's a sort of synergy between theology and epistemology, based on which we may offer good arguments from an epistemological point of view, arguments that can even be characterized by conclusiveness, and then can be accepted by everybody, both believers and unbelievers. Whereas, on the other hand, the reasons for proposing these arguments come from theology, come from faith. And then these reasons can be accepted only by believers, only by those who have faith. If I can say something more,
go ahead.
I can refer to Alvin Plantinga.
Yeah.
Alvin Plantinga says that Christianity and Christian faith can shape philosophy and even other academic disciplines. I believe that this implies the view that there is something specific to faith, something that radically distinguishes faith from reason. And this is a view that frontally opposes mere epistemology, because mere epistemology implies the idea that there is only one method by which we can respond to all of the possible problems. As Locke says, Locke is the main representative of mere epistemology. Locke says that we should not entertain any proposition with greater assurance than the proof it is built upon will warrant. This applies always to both religious and non-religious beliefs. But this view implies a monumental prejudice, which is the idea that we can take for granted that faith can be understood by a merely rational viewpoint. So we take for granted that faith cannot come from God. But this obviously is a prejudice. And it's interesting the fact that supporters of mere epistemology usually believe that mere epistemology deserves to be a default position simply because it seems to be exemplarily exempt of prejudice. Whereas what I've just said shows that, on the contrary, there is a monumental, substantial prejudice that affects the view that I call mere epistemology.
Right. No, that's actually a really good point of reference to the next question I want to ask. So, moving from that volume, which was what 2020 or something like that, to even a more recent volume that you wrote on Aquinas and faith. Can you kind of give your glossing of Aquinas' account of faith that you give in your volume, and kind of tell me maybe why your glossing should be preferred or why it's unique, something like that?
Yeah, in this book that I titled Aquinas and Faith, Reasoning, Charity, this is precisely what I try to show, what I mentioned before, the specificity of faith, what distinguishes faith from reason, which is charity, which is communion with God, love for Him. This clearly emerges from Aquinas' view. And let me say, it's not something that regards Aquinas' view, it regards an entire tradition. We need to take into consideration the fact that Aquinas, when he focuses on this idea of faith and the idea of faith that he champions, he makes reference to an entire tradition, Augustine, St. John of Damascus, and many others, in order to show that all that had been said before is included or is consistent with his view. And this is probably a reason why Aquinas' view of faith has exerted such a great influence until our days. Decades ago, John Hicks said that Aquinas' view of faith is the dominant view of faith in the context of Western society and culture, even for non-Christians, not only for among Christians, but also for non-Christians, which means that non-Christians, when they want to focus on the idea of faith, of the Christian faith, somehow implicitly refer to Aquinas' view. So this is just to say that it's a good argumentative strategy to take into consideration Aquinas' view of faith. What does Aquinas say? Aquinas says that faith is an intellectual assent to divine revelation. So there is an epistemic dimension of faith. And unless the assent is given to revelation because of our will. Aquinas justifies this by saying that divine revelation, at least its main tenets, is not characterized by full evidence. There is no full evidence in support of divine revelation. But on the other hand, believers are required to firmly adhere to divine revelation. So in order to understand how it is possible for believers to be firmly convinced, even if there is no full evidence, Aquinas says this is understandable because believers believe because of their will, under the command of the will, and their will is moved by God's grace. It's not just wishful thinking. The will is moved by God's grace in a specific way, which is charity, in a passage that is unfortunately usually overlooked by his scholars. Aquinas says that charity makes the will ready to believe, which means that it's because of love for God that one believes. If we combine this view with a belief that is practically commonsensical among believers, which is the idea that faith can be lived at different levels of intensity, we may say that the more one loves God, the more one trusts Him, the more one is ready to adhere to divine revelation. So it's charity that makes faith perfect, as Aquinas says. Charity plays a crucial role here. And one more thing that must be said is that charity plays a crucial role also when it comes to faith and reason. If we want to take into consideration the relationship between faith and reason, we need to understand adequately the two poles of this relationship. So if faith is so strongly characterized by charity, this will have effect on the relationship with reason. And the effect can be seen if we remember what I said before. If one commits oneself to God, one also commits oneself to the good. And then one is ready to develop good habits. And this puts one in the best possible condition to conduct intellectual activities. So charity, which is what distinguishes radically faith from reason, surprisingly, is exactly what makes faith able to promote rationality.
That's really interesting stuff there. Really appreciate it. Thanks for coming on, Roberto. This has been fun, and I'm looking
Thank
forward to
you.
your next book. Any idea what your research is going to be about next time?
Oh, I'm now working on commitment, on the idea of commitment to God and good, with regard to an extreme form of rationalism that is widespread in our society, which is transhumanism. So the idea is how transhumanism, and on the other hand, Christian religion, when it is taken into consideration, uh, focusing on commitments to God and good, how these two different experiences can respond to the problem of evil, to the problem of suffering and limitations. So it's a big project in which I will use a lot of materials that I'm preparing for papers, conferences, and so on. It's something similar to what I did while preparing the previous books.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you so much, Roberto. God bless you, and have a wonderful day.
God bless you, and many thanks again for this opportunity, Tyler. See you soon.
Absolutely. See you soon.